Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the National Network of Credit and Financial Professionals. I am here today with Jessica Butler, founder of Attain Consulting Group, who will be presenting on negotiation tips and strategies. A few items to get out of the way before we begin. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, you can ask them through the question function on your side panel. If you are looking for a copy of the slides, we will be sending a copy through email after the presentation is complete. The last item is that we will have a brief survey that pops up after the webinar ends. It only takes about 30 seconds to fill out, but it gives a lot of great information on how we continue to make our webinars better for you. And now, Ken Frisco to give you a brief intro of our speaker.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. This is Ken Frisco, Operating Board Director of the Federation of Credit and Financial Professionals. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar and just introduce Jessica. Basically, a quick bio on our background. She's the founder of Attain Consulting Group, which is a deduction and chargeback management advisory firm. Attain Consulting Group provides practical experience-based solutions in all areas of the deduction management process. Jessica is a former partner with Grant Thornton LLP and has over 30 years of consulting experience and dedicated most of the past 16 years focusing exclusively on the area of deduction and chargeback management. Jessica is a CPA and received her MBA from New York University. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jessica to start the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Ken, and welcome, everybody. So today we're going to talk about negotiation, tips, strategies. It's all about letting the other person have your way, letting them see how what you want might be the right way to go, and moving them in that direction. If you think about negotiation, often it's really communication. Anytime you want something that's a little bit different from somebody else, you're really negotiating. So whether you're talking about what restaurant do you want to go to or which version of a document should be sent, it's a negotiation. And really, it's looking at whether it's a disagreement or coming up with what's the best answer for something. How can you use a give and take? How can you figure out what's really joint problem solving and come up with an idea or a resolution that's acceptable to everyone? The real goal is coming up with something that both sides can agree to is fair and reasonable, and it can even work to strengthen your relationship. Really, as you see on the bottom bullet point, the ultimate goal in negotiating is to come away feeling satisfied, for everybody to feel good. And I really look at a lot of what we're going to talk about today. It's valid with whatever you're talking about and whoever you're talking about, whether you're talking to your customers, whether you're talking about and talking with people in your company, whether you're talking about your spouse or your children. These strategies work with everyone. The only time I don't think it really works is in situations where, like, you're buying a used car or something, and it really is sort of a battle and it's a win or lose. But most negotiations, most discussions shouldn't be about winning or losing. It should be about coming out with an idea, coming up with a resolution that you both feel good with. So here are some facts about negotiations, though, because not everyone has listened to this presentation and not everyone has the same feelings and beliefs about these sorts of things. So negotiations are not always neat or nice. Sometimes people take things personally and they can get kind of defensive. So one of the things that you try to do when you're negotiating is how can you keep your perspective? How can you really look at things and take a step back and look at things objectively. Negotiation shouldn't be a war. It shouldn't be about whether you win or lose. It really should be about, can we come up with something that everybody agrees is the right thing? And negotiation is a process. It's like a chess game sometimes. You don't go in and the first time you're having a discussion or an email or a phone call, it gets resolved. Sometimes there are different phases of a negotiation, and the more prepared you are and the more that you've thought through what might happen, often the better off it is. Negotiation also should not be about egos. And oftentimes when you're talking with people, if you catch them off guard or they're not prepared or you say things in a way that makes people defensive, then it becomes very challenging. And once people take things personally in a negotiation, often it's downhill from there, because then sometimes it's about saving face rather than whether it makes sense or not. So it's really trying to make sure that you're always communicating with the other person in a way that makes it easy for them to hear what you're saying. The bottom bullet here, that negotiation is not about perceptions, and really what that means is it's not about your perceptions, but it really is about the other person's perceptions. So one of the goals that you have in negotiating is try to figure out what are their perceptions, what do they think? Because when you're talking with someone, it's not about what you're saying, it's about what they're hearing. So it's not about, again, it's not what you mean, it's what they think you mean, it's what they hear. So the more you can think about what you're saying, and the more you can prepare and be accommodating in the way you're talking with someone else, often the better chance that you're going to have that they're going to come around to your side and see things your way. When we talk about negotiations, whether they're literally negotiations or conversations with people where you're talking about ideas that you have, I like to think about having a checklist. Sometimes the checklists are documented, so you really write things down, and other times you just go through some of the thought process to make sure that you're ready. So the first thing is, who are you negotiating with? Everybody has a different style. Everybody has different types of information that appeals to them or that they don't like. Some people are like charts and graphs and pictures. Some people like words. Some people want only a summary. Other people like a lot of detail. Look, some people are morning people and some people are afternoon people. The more that you know about the people that you're talking with, and the more you can fit your information and your delivery to the style that's going to most appeal to them, the better off you are. I know when I was at Grant Thornton, I had a manager there, and I could tell after just a few months of working with him that he really did not like to be asked questions sort of off the cuff. He was not really happy when people walked into his office and just asked him questions. I often found when I did that I didn't get the answer that I was hoping for, and then I had to spend quite a bit of time afterwards trying to kind of undo that. Even though I am the type of person that would like to just walk in and have a discussion and try to collaborate, I found that I was much better off if I would leave him a voicemail or send a message, an email, and ask him, here's the information, here's what I think about it, and let me know when we can talk about it. I found if I did that, often when he came back to me, it was a much better discussion. When I realized this, I was very excited about it, and I talked to other people in the department to let them know. And it was really interesting to me where a lot of people said, well, I'm not going to do that. He's the manager. He should adjust his style to me. That's not what I'm going to do. And I remember thinking at the time that it didn't matter to me whether who was in what position. The fact that I realized that I could handle situations in a certain way to make the outcome better, that made me really happy that I could do that. And of course I'd be willing to do that. And what I realize now is when people say they don't want to do that and they're not willing to do that, it's like they're taking it personally. They're looking at the situation, and rather than saying, I want to do what I need to do to get what I want at the end, they're able to take the situation and really kind of turn it around to get what you want, not saying, I'm not going to do it. I'm taking this personally and I refuse to be accommodating. For me, since I want my way at the end, I'd rather figure out how I can handle it. Sometimes my husband says it's a little manipulative, but I'd like to think of a better word that I can use. But what I know is that these tactics work. These strategies work, and when you employ them and when you start talking to people in certain ways and really make it trying to come up with the best solution, you can have a lot of success. So once you understand about the person that you're talking about, also think about what are the key issues. Does everybody understand the issues? If there's some information that had to be sent, does everybody have it? Did you have the information? Understand what you're willing to compromise. What are you willing to give? What's the negotiating environment? Are you negotiating in person? Is it over the phone? Is it over email? What sort of a decision has to be made? Who asked for the meeting or the phone call? What are the ground rules? Make sure that the person still has time to talk or to meet. What are you hoping to get out of the meeting? Understand how decisions are made and the authority that different people have. Getting back to information a little bit, think about what information you need to get everybody up to speed. And is the information going to be acceptable? Do you have to discuss it even before you have kind of any negotiations, or do you need more information? So often when you're dealing with your customers, having the information is really important. And you really want to have credibility with your customers. So having a meeting or discussing something when it's not ready or you're not ready can often be more harmful than trying to postpone the meeting. You also want to think about your negotiation strategy, and don't only have one strategy. You want to have sort of a best case scenario and maybe a middle of the line and maybe what you're willing to accept at the bottom. Understand that, and if you need to get approval or if you don't have the authority but you want to get someone to look at some things in advance and give you the authority for certain constraints or a certain tolerance, I'd recommend that. Think through what the solutions are and what options you have. I think that's really a very good idea. And a lot of times people come in, if we're dealing with deductions, for example, they come in and they say, well, I want to get repaid. And you say, well, like, what's your second choice? What do you mean my second choice? Or I want a waiver. We cannot comply with this requirement, so we want it waived. Well, what if they say no? What are you going to do? And if someone says, well, that's not fair, well, to me, that's not the right strategy. Is there something else you're willing to accept? Let's say you can't comply, for example, with a requirement initially, and the customer says that they're not going to waive that. Well, maybe they won't waive it, but would they reduce the cost offset for a while? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Let's say they won't. Maybe your third alternative might be saying, let's say if in 6 months or 3 months we're able to comply with this requirement, if you see that we don't have any more deductions for this reason, would you go back and maybe work with us on some of those deductions that you gave us in the past? Oftentimes I find that this might work with a lot of customers. So again, if I only go in with one option, one alternative, as soon as the other side says no, I'm kind of lost. So I want to come up with and have in my back pocket different ideas, different things that will be acceptable to me. Also think about in a negotiation, what's the method? How is it going to be reached? Does it have to be written? Can it be oral? Do you need feedback, approval from others? And how is it going to be implemented? Who's responsible? What's the timeline? Whenever I have a negotiation, even if we come to some agreement or a resolution, I like to be able to say, well, let's come up with a plan. If it doesn't work the way we said it's going to, what would you like me to do? Okay, you're going to repay these deductions. That's really great. And it's, by the end of the week, terrific. Let's say it doesn't happen. If there's a problem and it doesn't happen, what should we do? Who should I call? When would you like me to follow up to figure it out? Much better to come up with sort of how you're going to handle a situation than not talk about it and then not know what to do afterwards. When you're negotiating, again, because you're trying not to take things personally, you really want to look at the situation. You want to be objective. You're going to focus on the problem, not the other person. You want to pretend that you and the other person are both looking at the same issue together and see how you can come to the same resolution. I often feel that if the other person is not seeing the situation the same way that I am, then there's an assumption that they're missing. Because somehow if I've gone through all of the steps and I come to a conclusion, I feel that the other side should come to the same conclusion if we're using the same fact pattern. So I look at it very objectively. And so I want to walk that person through my facts to see what am I missing? And if it's not something I'm missing, might it be something that they're missing or don't understand? So I really look at things that way, and I honestly believe that usually things work out that way, and so that's how I go into these discussions. Also, when you're negotiating, what you want is to have the other person feel, or the other people feel, that they're part of the discussion and they're part of the solution. So you want to make sure that they're sharing decisions or suggestions. You want to ask them a lot of questions. A little bit later on in today's discussion, I'm going to talk about prompts that I use. And these are really the beginning of sentences or questions that will allow you to get information from the other side and find out more about their opinion. Because you really want to see what the common ground is. You want to start there and then figure out what the differences are. And in order to do that, you've got to get as much information as you can about the other person or the other situation. You want to ask them for their ideas and opinions. They may say something that you did not consider, and if so, that may change your approach. And that's what you want to find out, because you may be thinking they're saying something for one reason only to find out it's another reason. So you should never assume that you know why they're saying something. You should always ask them. It's very important also when you're negotiating or communicating with people at all, look at their nonverbal behavior. So that really directly affects the negotiation process. And if your nonverbal behavior doesn't match your verbal behavior, people generally go with a nonverbal behavior. It just sort of is an automatic thing. It's a little bit difficult over the phone, but certainly if I'm talking with you and I seem energetic and my tone is fine, then you're a little bit more engaged. I could be talking like this, saying exactly the same information, but it's just not going to be as entertaining, and it's just not going to make you feel the same way. And regardless of the information, if the delivery is not good, you're going to feel the information is not as good as it could have been. And when people are physically in front of you, whether they're leaning forward or whether they're leaning back, their arms are crossed or not crossed, you should use that to your advantage and understand what's going on. So another example is if I'm meeting with someone in person, and let's say we're sitting at a desk together and we're talking, and suddenly the person leans back and they fold their arms in front of them. Well, either the temperature in the room went down by 20 degrees, or I probably said something that they didn't agree with. And when I said it, it caused them to sort of lean back from the situation and fold their arms. So for me, what I would try to do at that point is do a little bit of a checkpoint. I might stop and say, so what do you think? Do you agree with that? Or do you think that would be a problem? Just to see what they're thinking. I would rather do that than just continue on and on when I may have lost that person. I really want to stop and do a little bit of an assessment to see how things are going. So use that information so you can really use that to your advantage when you're meeting with people, to kind of look at them and see what they're saying, listen to their pitch, the intonation, the eye contact. It can really help you to see how you're doing and whether what you're saying sort of is hitting the mark, or maybe you need to stop and do a little bit of an assessment. There are some great words to avoid when you're talking with people and words to replace them with. This slide, when I finish with this slide, I definitely recommend that, maybe at some point print this out and put it up somewhere where you'll look at it all the time. It's great not only when you're speaking verbally to someone, but also in emails. So one word is the word you. You often comes with a finger point. And it can be very inflammatory when you use it with people. You're pointing the finger at them and you're telling them that they did something wrong. So it often leaves them kind of defenseless, or feeling that they have to be defensive. Much better to use the word I instead. So I'll give you an example. I'll use my kids in this example. My kids were watching TV. They'd love to watch TV. And I might say to them, okay, guys, TV off in a half an hour, okay? And they'd say, oh, yeah, okay, Mom. And then I'd come back 45 minutes later, and big surprise, the TV would still be on. So I would say, hey, you guys said the TV was going to be off in a half an hour, and it's not off. And it would not be a great conversation, and we probably would leave feeling a little irritated with each other. So what I started to do instead is come up and say, gee, I must have misunderstood. I thought we had agreed that the TV was going to go off in a half an hour, which is a lot less threatening to hear. It means the same thing, but to be on the receiving end of that means that maybe I did make a mistake, but I was under the impression that we were going to turn it off. To which the kids would say, oh no, we did agree, but we didn't know that another episode of SpongeBob was coming on, or whatever they would say. But I would then say, gee, well, what are we going to do? Because that was the agreement. And they might say, okay, we're going to turn it off right now and no more TV for the rest of the day. And I'd say, okay. That's fine. And we'd finish the conversation. There would be no hard feelings. They would take ownership for what they did. And sometimes there may be certain things, certainly not with the TV, but there may be certain cases with people that I'm talking with where when I say that, gee, I might have misunderstood, and you know what? I did misunderstand, or something had changed. And it was so much easier for that person to tell me that rather than I had almost accused them of not doing something that we had agreed to. So it's sort of giving the person the benefit of the doubt and allowing them to say, no, you were right. We didn't hold up our end of the bargain for a certain reason. So that's the first word. The second word is the word but. When you use the word but in a sentence, it often means, and it's certainly people feel like it means you didn't really mean what you said at the beginning of the sentence. So if I say to someone, you did a really great job, but I had some thoughts on how things can get better, the person is feeling like, okay, you didn't really think I did a good job. Let me know what you really think. Even if that's not what you mean, that's often how it's perceived. It's just how we kind of use the word. On the other hand, if you use the word and, A-N-D, it's a lot softer. So if I were to say, hey, you did a really great job, and I had some thoughts on how we can even make some additional improvements, it's a lot easier to hear. It's a lot easier on the listener. And if you remember what I said earlier, it's really not about what you mean, it's what the other person hears. And if you think about, I want what I want at the end, then I'm willing to do what it takes to get the other person to hear what I'm saying and to agree with what I want. So I encourage you to try not to use the word but when you're talking, and especially in emails, it's a lot easier to check. We use the word so frequently. I've realized these days that people use the word but sometimes instead of or and or It's almost like a pause. And it's really very difficult to have a collaborative discussion with someone when they're using the word but. Can't. When you use the word can't or always or never, these types of things, they always make me kind of think of the opposite. So if someone says I can't do something, I'm only thinking about how I can do it and how I'm going to do it. Or if I always do something, I'm going to think about the time I didn't. Same thing with never, I'm going to think about how I did. So rather than get people focusing on the one exception, so much better to make it a little softer and say, gee, we haven't been able to do this so far, or it hasn't worked out to date, but we're still trying. Rather than always never, to say, hey, this time this happened, today this happened. It's so much better. And this always and never, it's really, really important with your kids. I don't know how many people on the call have children, but you should try not, unless it's a positive thing, if you're correcting action or you're pointing out something, an area for improvement, it's great not to be able to, not to have to say always or never. If you say to your children, you never make your bed, you're always sloppy, you're always late, what you find is you will turn them into whatever it is you are telling them they are always or they are never. They will kind of live down to that expectation. So much better to try to be more encouraging, and when you're talking about opportunities, be specific about, hey, today you weren't able to do that. Let's see if we can get it better tomorrow. Should have, ought to have. Again, people don't like to be told what to do. So rather than kind of be a dictator and say, hey, here's how we're going to do it, or this is what you should have done, so much better to say, I wonder whether it makes sense for us to do it this way going forward. Or what do you think about handling it like this going forward? Is that a good idea? Do you see any problems? And again, it's just a softer way of asking the information, and it makes it a lot easier for the other side to hear it and respond to it in a positive way, in a collaborative way, rather than feel kind of attacked and take things personally. So when you're negotiating, you also want to make sure you're prepared. You need to do your homework. And doing your homework tries to ensure that you're going to come up with and work towards a win-win solution with the other side. In order to do that, you really need to know as much as you can about them, about their motives, about what their objections are going to be, what the problems are going to be. You want to try to avoid assumptions and really make sure you're ready and you've got the details and focus on the interests of the person. So in order to get ready for your side, as we talked about a little bit earlier, you want to make sure you understand what do you want out of the negotiation and are your expectations realistic. So I often get involved with my clients in whether it's negotiation practice or preparation or working with them with some of their key customers in negotiation situations, and I look at always, are the expectations realistic? So for example, if I have a client that's looking to get repaid for certain deductions, I'll find out, well, were the deductions valid? And they might say, oh yeah, they were very valid. We were wrong. We had the ASNs were all wrong. They were all late. We didn't send them out. It was a big problem. Okay, well, have you fixed the problem? Oh no, we haven't fixed the problem. And then what do you want though? Oh, we want to get that money back. So right then I'll stop them and say, let's switch sides for a minute. And if you were your customer, would you do that? Would you give you the money back when you hadn't fixed the problem? And maybe you're not even taking ownership of the problem. And it usually gets people to think. And it usually gets them to stop and say, maybe not. So if you were to switch sides with the other person and heard the story that you were giving yourself, would you agree to whatever the result was? And if you wouldn't agree, then maybe you need to think of a different expectation, or you need to come up with a different approach, or maybe you're not ready for that discussion. You should be willing, if you were on the other side, to agree with whatever it is you're saying. And think about, what are you willing to settle for? Come up with a list of the alternatives. We talked about this a little earlier. And what are the interests? And make sure you've got supporting documentation so that you could walk someone through how you got there. You also really want to understand the other person's position. You want to understand kind of their interests. You want to be able to anticipate, but you really want to ask questions as well. You want to try to limit your own talking. Often, especially on the phone, people are very uncomfortable with silence. So they quickly try to fill that silence and keep going, when really it's okay to limit your own talking and ask for questions. Some of those prompts that we're going to talk about are things like saying to the other person, what do you think we should do? And then having silence to hear what they say. Or you know your business, or you know the situation better than I do in your department. How would you recommend we approach this? And then listen to what they say. Stay calm. Don't jump to conclusions, and don't take things personally. Usually when people are saying things, even if they're negative and they're no and they're not going to agree with you, usually it doesn't have anything to do with you personally. It has to do with the situation, or maybe they're having a bad day for something completely different than what you were thinking about. So don't jump to conclusions. Try not to take it personally. Notice the feedback, or give them feedback and get feedback, and try to notice their nonverbal behavior. Two different types of questions that you can ask people. You can ask open-ended questions, which are questions designed to learn more about the specific situation or learn what is motivating their behavior. Usually start with why or what or how. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? What do you think about this? How do you think we would approach this? Do you think this would be a problem? What would be the problem with doing something this way? So these are the types of prompts that you would use for getting more information and understanding more about what's motivating that person. Then once you have that information, you might use closed-ended questions. And these are questions that, after you ask them, are answered usually with a yes or no. And they're really used to confirm what you've learned through the open-ended questions. So it might be, okay, so do you agree that if I were to send you this information, then we'd be able to get a waiver for that issue? Those types of things. You want to confirm what you've learned so far and make sure that everybody's on the same page. You also want to focus on the other person's interest, what's important to them, not the fact that they said no. So just if they've said no, you don't want to say, gee, I don't understand why you're saying that, but you want to, again, really try to understand the underlying objections or the underlying motivation for saying what they're saying. What are you most concerned about? What problems do you see? Sometimes people say no because they don't have the authority to say yes. So sometimes when you're asking people things and you feel like you're being very clear and you've given them great information and they just will not agree with you, it's a good thing to not just blurt out, do you have the approval to say yes, but to say it in a way such as, gee, if I was able to give you the information to show you that this really was not valid, would you be able to reverse it? Is that something that could happen? They might say, oh, no, that's not something I can do. I need to provide that information to my manager. And if you get that information, then that's great to know. And you could then say, oh, would it be easier for me to talk directly with your manager? Or what information can I provide you to make it easier? How can I make this work? Because I really think we're in the right here. When people do kind of object or they're saying things that are different than what you had thought, acknowledge the objections. You don't want to just continue with whatever you were saying because everybody knows how it feels to talk with someone and feel that the other person's not listening. It doesn't make you feel very good. So make sure that you're listening and make sure that you give them a verbal response, or I understand, or I can see why that could be a problem. I never thought of it that way. Yes, that is something we need to work on. Understand those types of things, but also evaluate if it's a real issue, if it's a valid objection, or whether you might have caught someone off guard and they're getting a little bit defensive. Because if they're getting a little defensive, you may want to back off. You may decide that it's time to sort of end that meeting and set up another one, or see how to handle the situation. When people say no, again, and I know I've said it over and over again, but it's so easy for us to take things personally when someone says something and we're disappointed it's not what we wanted to hear. So it's important to say it to yourself over and over again. This doesn't have anything to do with me. It's the situation. And if you've really thought through the discussion and if you've thought through what could happen during your discussion, you may have already planned for it. You may be prepared for it, and they may be going right along in the script that you laid out in your head. So you want to have alternative plans ready. You want to be able to offer other suggestions, or you also might want to be able to ask them. This is a great time to say, well, what do you think we should do? How do you think we should handle it? What would make it successful for you? How could we come up with a strategy so that we both feel that what we've done is acceptable? And also make sure you're acknowledging their objections. I respect that you share this with me. I appreciate your telling me. I agree that this makes things difficult. And as I mentioned earlier, if you feel that it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction, you might want to suggest a temporary postponement. Or if you've got new information that you weren't aware of and you're not ready, you don't need to take it personally or get defensive. You can say, wow, you know what? I never thought of that, or I never looked at it from that side before. You're right. Let me take this information. Let me go back. Let me think a little bit. Can we talk about it again later or tomorrow or whatever it is? That's okay. We talked a little bit about, again, here are some prompts when people say no. I respect your honesty. I appreciate, I agree. These are just really good things to be ready to say so that you're not caught off guard. Because when you're caught off guard, that's when you try to make something up quickly, and that's when you get kind of defensive, and that's when things often kind of head south, and that's not the direction we want them to go in. Then the next level of a person has to do with being, let's say, a difficult person. So somebody that maybe a little verbally abusive, maybe really isn't talking very nicely or acting very nicely. And the first thing to understand is often people who are very hard to get along with usually have low self-esteem. And the only way they make themselves feel better is by putting other people down. So again, don't take it personally. It almost never has anything to do with you. And make sure that you kind of just stay above the fray And I'll give you a couple of suggestions on different things that you might be able to do. And first of all, I don't know if any of you were ever waiters or waitresses in earlier lives, but if any of you are, I'm sure that you all know that you might have been assigned a table, and you look over and you can tell even before you've been over there that that person is not in a good mood. I mean, there is a problem. And you weren't even there, so it could not have been anything that you've done. So you had a decision. You were either going to go in there and give it right back to that person if they gave it to you, or what I often did, I don't know why, I took it as a game. I thought I was going to be so nice to this person that they were either going to come out of their funk or they would like leave or something like that. It just was my nature. So a couple of ways to deal with people who are really difficult. The first is when someone has said something and maybe it was a spur of the moment, spontaneous, very kind of defensive thing, to say, I'm sorry, I don't think I understood that. Would you mind repeating that? Because usually when people blurt things out, they're not going to say it twice. So they often will make it a little bit easier. Or the second thing is you might say, gee, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you just said we should, and I wouldn't say what they said word for word necessarily, but if it's some unrealistic thing, I would say that, and then they'd say, no, that's not what I said. Okay. It's also a great opportunity to say, what do you think we should do? Sometimes the first thing that they suggest you do is not realistic, and you might say, yeah, no, that's great, but I don't think that's realistic or that will never happen. So really, what do you think we should do? If you were in my shoes, what would you recommend? If you need to disengage, and certainly, especially if it's people internally within your organization, to keep some records. I remember once I do negotiation workshops at companies where I spend a day and we go through this sort of information, and then we do a lot of role playing. And someone in the customer service area said to me that she worked the switchboard sometimes during lunch, and she was at the switchboard and someone called, and she could tell when she answered that he was really unhappy. And so he asked for his salesperson, and she said, I'm sorry, he's out to lunch. And the guy said, he's not allowed to go to lunch, or he can't be at lunch. And she didn't know what to do. He was yelling, so she hung up the phone. And she said, gee, what would you have done? And I said, well, probably I wouldn't have hung up the phone. That might not have been the best thing to do, but I understand that you really felt like you didn't know what to do. I said, I'm kind of sarcastic, so probably when the person said, he can't be out to lunch, I would have said, I'm sorry, you mean he's not allowed to take a lunch, or it's not a good time for lunch? So I would have done something to make him either just realize that he was acting inappropriately and calm down, or maybe he would have hung up on me. But either way, I'm just trying to find a way to diffuse the situation, because it probably has absolutely nothing to do with you. And this is also true when you're talking about emails. I'm sure everyone has gotten emails where it's like big font, all capital, a lot of symbols and all that sort of stuff, and you look at that and you're like, oh my God, you get one of those emails and you look at it, and maybe your first reaction is, okay, hit reply, and I'm like, cap lock on, baby, I'm coming right back at you. And that might be our first reaction. But I would encourage and challenge each of you, if that happens, take a step back, take a couple of breaths, try to read in between the lines. Try to think about, what is this person saying, and how can I respond in a way that acts as though they were saying something nicely. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they misinterpreted something. No reason to escalate the issue. Let me answer really nicely. So I try to answer really nicely and say, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding, or I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I'm assuming, whatever it is, in a very nice way. 9 times out of 10, if you're able to do that, an email comes back right afterwards, like, really sorry about my first email, I had having a bad day, or I didn't understand, or I didn't see something. So there's no reason for you to to get into something with your fist swinging. Better to take a deep breath and to say, okay, I'm going to take the high road. That's what I often think when I look at things. So when you're dealing with negotiation in general, or communication in general, I really think that Preparation, patience, and perseverance are all really, really important. Patience is one of the most important things that you have, because when you're patient, it gives you strength in negotiating situations. It makes you think there's no reason I need to get to the end today. This is fine. I don't have a problem. I've prepared for it. I'm ready. This is going right on cue, exactly what I thought. And satisfaction that you get from negotiation, there's a continuum. You're not always happy, but hopefully you're not always devastated either. If you are successful, you want to think about what happened that made me successful. Did I just have like the best facts and there was no other way it could go? Or did I do something that I can repeat for the next one? Did I set it up the right way? Did I don't know, what did I do? And similarly for failures, if I had to do it over again, would I do something differently? Was I not ready for that meeting? Did I not send the right information? Did I not ask for their opinion? Or was this like a no-win situation going in? Think about that and then help yourself. Think about even, let's say, a couple of examples. Come up with some alternatives. What would you do? Like, let's say the customer's not paying a past due invoice because they've got a cash flow issue. So what are you going to do? Are you going to say, I'm sending you to collections? Or are you going to say, well, let's talk about what you can do? How can we make this, how can we come up with a payment plan that works for you? What are you going to do? If the customer doesn't agree to repay a deduction and you feel that you've provided proof beyond a reasonable doubt, what can you do? How can you find out whether they have the right authority? How could you find out how you could escalate it, or what they think you're missing that maybe you're not seeing? If those types of things, you understand it. Look at number 3 here, the bullet point number 3. If the customer won't pay a past due invoice because you're denying the credit line, that might be very different than the first bullet point where they're not paying because of cash flow issues. But if you haven't asked the question or you haven't determined why they're not paying, then you may not be able to come up with the right alternative. Also think about what things you might say. How do you maintain your cool? Like, how can you not take it personally? When you're not in control of a situation or you're not prepared, what can you do? Maybe you might say, this is new information, I'm not really sure. Maybe I want to reconvene. If you're not moving towards a mutually acceptable solution, be ready to talk about what you can do. Think through, have those prompts kind of in your back pocket and be ready to discuss them. Kind of a few final things to think about. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. If you're getting ready for a negotiation and you think you've got a great situation or you think you're ready, play the other side. Play the other side and pretend that someone is handing you the information that you've prepared. Do you agree? Do you come to the same conclusion? Is there anything else you would want to see? Try to understand the other person's perspective. In everything that you do, in every negotiation that you have, every communication, again, whether it's with your children or your spouse or your customer or other people in your organization, try to understand their perspective. And it really sometimes changes things. And it gives you a little more compassion, or it helps you understand that you might need to be a little more flexible. How will the other person hear your words? Don't think about just saying something the way you want to and say it doesn't really matter how I say it. How you say things really does matter. And once you say something, if the person heard it in a certain way, it's really hard to undo that. So much better to take a little bit more time and think about what you're going to say and practice and read some of these things over and over until it becomes second nature. When people are talking to you, think about things you can say instead of no. So when someone asks a question, lots of times you say, no, you can't do that. Often you're not ready. You're buying yourself time. So 3 things that you can say instead of saying no. One is, convince me, help me understand. Like, gee, that's not the conclusion I got to, so I don't really understand how you got there. The second thing is, oh, yes, we can do that as soon as we do something else or after something else. I use this a lot with my daughter growing up. She would come, as I'm putting dinner on the table, she might come to me and say, can I have this my dessert now. And like, no, you can't have your dessert now. That's what I wanted to say, and that would be a big fight. Very, very stubborn, my daughter and me, and so that would be a problem. And so I learned to say, when she would come and say, can I have this dessert now? I'd say, oh, yeah, of course you can. Here, let's just put it right at the top of your plate, and as soon as we're done with dinner, you can have it. We'll put it right there. And she'd say, okay, that's great. And I'd say, wow, crisis avoided. So it's a great way when you're talking to other people, if they say something and you don't agree with it or you don't think that's going to fly, maybe you could say, yes, I think if we're able to modify this a little bit, that would work. That's so much better than saying, no, we can't do it that way. You want to think about how you can be accommodating and how you can collaborate with the other person. And the third thing to say instead of saying no is, let me think about it a minute. I'm not sure. Ways you can find out about the other person's perspective is asking, and I mentioned these before, but again, think about them, write them down, practice them, saying, what do you think we should do? How would you handle this? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Think about how you respond to things. So if someone says something to you that you don't agree with, or it's different from what you were thinking, what is your first reaction? Do you automatically think, oh, they're wrong? Or maybe, like, we have a different assumption, or maybe there's a misunderstanding. Like, if you automatically assume they're wrong, then you're going to go into the situation kind of with the most combative approach or perspective, as opposed to, I must not have been clear in what I explained because that's not how I would have gotten it. Or maybe even to be able to say to someone, wow, that's not how I would have approached it. Let me know your thought process. You might find out that they did something that was even better than what you had thought about. Or if people don't meet your expectations, do you feel that they're incompetent? Or do you think that they're trying to do their best? What I've found is kind of that I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, because people live either up to or down to your expectations. So I try to celebrate the success to make people feel good about what they're doing, to make them want to do more of it, and try to accept or coach the weaknesses. People learn faster from successes than failures. So when I'm working with people or managing people, I try to set them up for success. And don't forget the words to avoid and words to use. It's really very helpful. So when you're thinking about negotiation, it's really helpful and important to provide training to make people more effective. While the techniques are very basic, they're not necessarily intuitive. So nothing that I said is difficult, but if this is not the way you were brought up, or if these are not communication styles that you learned, it's a learned skill, and it may not kind of come naturally. The more that you practice, the more that you can improve the chances of success. So I encourage role playing. Sometimes it feels kind of silly, especially if you do both sides yourself, but grab another person, practice, play your side, play the other side, and you'll get to a point where you realize, wow, like I wanted to say no, but you presented it in such a way that it made me feel like we should work on this together. That's what you want to do. That's where you want to get to, because the more you prepare, the greater the rewards. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have questions, I'd love to take them now. Also, you can see my email address on the bottom of your screen. If you have a question but you don't feel comfortable sharing it now, or something comes to you later, please feel free to reach out to me. I love this stuff, and I can always come up with kind of lots of ways to handle situations.
All right, Jessica, you ready for your first question?
I hope so.
Okay. How can we get the most out of a negotiation process in case of cultural differences?
Well, in terms of cultural differences, I think that I would try to first learn as much as I could about the other culture, so that I try not to make any really, really bad mistakes if possible. But then I probably would be pretty upfront and say to the other person or the other side that I'm dealing with, I really want to make sure that we're able to work through any cultural differences. So if I say anything or propose anything that seems out of line to you, please let me know so that we can try to work through it, because that's not what I'm trying to do.
Great.
And if that doesn't answer whoever's question, feel free to send me a follow-up, and with more specifics, I'll try to help.
Sure. Well, actually, at this time, there are no further questions, so I will provide your email address when I send the PDF version of the presentation later today for all those on the call, and they will be able to follow up with you directly. And with that, we're actually going to close today's webinar. I would like to thank you, Jessica, for taking the time to present to our group today, and thank everyone on the call for taking the time out of their day to join us. And thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Great. Thanks.
You're welcome. Bye.